Greetings, beautiful people, and welcome to the video for Chapter 11, Making Decisions. For this learning experience, you're going to want to make sure that you have printed your lecture outline for Chapter 11 so that you can track along with me as I work my way through the lecture outline, sharing examples that hopefully illuminate the concepts and make it a bit easier for you to apply them. So grab that lecture outline and buckle up. As your lecture outline indicates, decision making is all about making choices. We do this every day, of course. We make choices about simple, straightforward things, and we make choices about really difficult things, complex decisions that require lots of hard thinking. If you're going to be an effective leader, you've got to learn to make effective decisions. And when I say effective, remember what we mean by that. We mean that your decisions have to accomplish the goals to which they're related. You also need to be able to make efficient decisions. And what I mean by that is simple. You need to be able to make decisions in a timely fashion. You're never going to have all of the information you need to make the really complex decisions without any uncertainty. So you're going to have to get used to basically deciding, okay, I've got enough. It's time to go ahead and make the decision. And then you're going to have to make it knowing that at least some of the time, you're going to make not so great decisions. You're going to fail, and that's okay. The consequences of most decisions when they're made badly, frankly, aren't earth-shattering, won't end your life, won't harm anyone in any significant way. So it's okay to recognize that, sometimes, again, because you just don't have all of the information that you might wish you did, and because it's frankly too expensive in terms of time or other metrics to get more information, well, some of the decisions you make, I should say, just aren't going to be that great. C'est la vie. So I'm on the first page of your lecture outline, very much near the top. Let me talk very briefly about types of decisions. Some decisions are programmed, meaning they happen often enough, we have to make them often enough, that we basically decide on, create a rule that helps us make those decisions. This allows us to not think too hard, which is great because thinking hard is really difficult for us. It's not the way our brains prefer to work. We prefer to come up with pretty straightforward schema that allow us to get through our day without having to consciously think about most of the decisions we make. Simple things like, which side of the bed should we get out of? When we get into the shower, what should we do first? As we're getting ready to go to school or to work, how should we pack our backpack? Should we walk or take a car? And if we take a car, what route should we take? These are all decisions that, for the most part, once we've made them a few times, we don't consciously make them anymore. We just go forward, and we don't think about these activities really as decision-making anymore. They're just part of our life. These are programmed decisions. The harder decisions are the non-programmed ones. These are the ones that are really complex, that in fact do require our critical thinking. They're the ones where we've got a lot of different criteria to try and consider, where it's highly likely that we won't have all the information we wish we had in order to make the decision. They're decisions that we don't have to make very often, so we can't really develop very good rules or standard metrics. They're tough. Things like, what school should I go to? What major should I pick? What should be my profession? Do I want to marry this person? Do I want to have children? Where do I want to live? With whom? How do I want to spend the rest of my life? Wow. These are really challenging, non-programmed decisions. I'm quite certain that you've had to make lots of these. Now, If we slip into the world of organizations, your lecture outline tells you that there are 3 categories of classifying decisions. We've got strategic decisions. These are the ones that set the course for the organization. These are the decisions that are made by the people who are at the very top of the organization, the people in what we call the C-suite, the CEO, right, the chief executive officer, the CFO, the chief financial officer, the COO, the chief operating officer, basically all the C's, and the executive vice presidents, and whatever frou-frou titles they might have that indicate to everyone quite clearly, these are the people at the top. Their job is to look into the future and taking into account everything they know about the organization and the environment in which it operates, trying to make decisions about the direction of the organization. If you look in the table at the bottom of page 1, you see some examples of the kinds of decisions that people at this level make. Should we merge with another company? Should we pursue a new product line? Should we downsize our organization? What that means is, should we reduce the number of people working for this organization, and or should we reduce the number of locations? These are big strategic decisions. A second kind of decision made in organizations is tactical. Tactical decisions are decisions about how we do things. So strategic ones are, what should we be doing overall? Tactical is, how are we going to get it done? The folks who typically make these decisions are managers throughout the organization. And they're thinking about things like, what should we do to help facilitate this merger? How can we help our employees from the 2 different companies now get along as part of the new merged company? The decision's been made to have a new product line. How should we market that product line? To whom should we market that product line? And then a final example, if we're going to downsize, if we've decided that we need to let some people go for whatever reason, who should we let go? How do we decide who should get to stay and who should be helped to find another opportunity? The third kind of organizational decision is called an operational decision. This is the day-to-day stuff. This is what most of us, quite frankly, have to make, because most of us, our role in the organization is as an employee. We don't yet own the place. We're not yet top management. We might not even be managers. So we're just the folks who actually make the stuff get done. So what kind of decisions are we having to make? Well, imagine that you're part of a newly merged company. You might have to decide, how often should I be communicating with my new coworkers? And how should I communicate with my new coworkers? Maybe the folks in your in the new organization who came from the other organization aren't used to using electronically mediated communication, for example. Maybe they prefer face-to-face. Well, what's the best approach? Second, what should we say to customers about our new product? And finally, if we downsize and I'm left behind as an employee, what do I need to do to balance my new work demands, knowing that even though we've let a whole bunch of people go, probably all the work still needs to get done? Again, these are the 3 kinds of decisions made within organization: strategic, tactical, and operational. So let's go ahead and talk about some different ways that a person might make decisions. The first approach that one might use is what's called the rational decision-making approach. Now, let me tell you something about rational decision-making. It sounds like the best kind of decision-making, doesn't it? Rational. That word, when we hear it, we think, ooh, that means it's reasonable. That means it's the best way. That means that's what smart people do. Well, that's not necessarily the case. In fact, rational decision-making only applies in certain kinds of situations. If we try to use it in other kinds of situations, it's not going to work, and it doesn't make any sense. It would cause us to be ineffective in our decision-making and inefficient, and we don't want to commit either of those sins. So let me talk very briefly, first of all, about what rational decision making is, and then I'll tell you a little bit about when you shouldn't use it. So rational decision making is basically a step-by-step approach. As you can see when you look at your lecture outline, it starts by identifying the problem. What's the situation for which we need a decision? That's what we mean by identify the problem. What's the issue? Basically, why do we need to make a decision? So that's how it starts. From there, we choose decision criteria. I'll explain more what that means when I go through this whole model with an example. We attach weights to those decision criteria. Basically, we decide which of them is the most important, which is the least important, and everything in between. Then we generate as many alternatives as make sense, as are possible, given what we're trying to decide. So we think about all the different options, okay? Then we evaluate those alternatives using the decision criteria that we've established. So we decide of the alternatives, which choice makes the most sense given the criteria that we've previously identified. With that information in hand, the rational decision-making model says it should be relatively easy for you to choose the best alternative. Just pick the one that best fits the criteria. Go ahead then and implement the decision. So you've made the choice. Go ahead and do what you need to do given that choice. And then at some later point, evaluate your decision. Was it a good one? Did you in fact achieve the criteria that you were hoping to achieve? So let's do a quick example with this. Let's imagine that you're at a restaurant and you're trying to choose from 3 different entrees. So it's dinner time and you've got to make a choice. And the restaurant that you're in has about 10 options, okay? It's one of those nice restaurants that maybe has everything on one sheet of paper. Those are my favorite. The ones I hate are the ones that are pages and pages and pages. It's overwhelming, right? I just want to eat dinner. But let's imagine you're in one of these places. Like I said, it's a one-pager. And you've narrowed it down to 3. Let's say that it's a seafood place for the most part, but you can't eat seafood. So there are only 3 entrees that don't feature seafood. Now you've got to decide among them. So here we have our options. Those 3. Well, what are the decision criteria that you might use? Well, one of the things that you might consider is price. Another thing that you might consider is likely portion size. Maybe you're not super hungry, but you're hungry enough that you know you could eat at least a certain amount. Maybe another consideration is, what have you eaten in the last day or so? Maybe you don't want to repeat what you've eaten. So with those criteria in mind, you think to yourself, which of these is the most important? And this is something that we do pretty routinely. For some of you, it might be the price. For others, it might be the portion size. For still others, it might be, how does this compare to things that I've eaten in the last 24 or so hours? So you've got your alternatives. You put each of those alternatives up against the criteria that you'd identified. Let's say your alternatives include a chicken dish, a steak dish, and maybe a pasta dish, okay? Of the 3, the pasta dish is the least expensive. The steak dish is the most expensive. In the last 24 hours, you had some pasta for lunch. You know that the portion size for the steak is actually pretty big compared to what you might typically like to eat. So after you've looked at all those alternatives and you've weighed them up against your decision criteria, the things that you care about the most, perhaps you decide, I want to go with the chicken. That's the one that I want. Okay, so you go ahead and you order the chicken. That's you implementing your decision. You eat your entree, your chicken entree, and at a later point, you evaluate, maybe even while you're still eating it, was this the best choice? Did you make the right choice? Now, part of what might influence your evaluation is looking to see what other people at the table ordered. If somebody else ordered the steak And all they've been doing is raving about how fantastic it is. And in the meantime, you've decided your chicken dish was kind of dry, maybe not what you had hoped for. Well, now you might experience some regret, right? On the other hand, if what you've had to eat tastes great, was just the right portion size, fit the price range that you were hoping for, and again, it doesn't overlap with the pasta that you had for lunch, you might think to yourself, wow, I made a fantastic decision. Well, good for you, right? Now, under what conditions does this model not work? This model does not work when you have lots and lots and lots of options. Human beings can only process so many options and so many criteria effectively. After a certain point, we become terribly inefficient. In fact, it becomes impossible for us to make a decision. So for the most part, for most things, if there are a lot of options or there are a lot of decision criteria that might matter, we don't use the rational decision-making model. Computers can use the rational decision-making model, let's say in logistics. But human beings, we can't grapple with all that information. The other reality is, even when we have a smaller set of alternatives, it can be really difficult to decide how they might match up to the criteria that we've identified. And so, as a result, again, the rational decision-making model isn't that great. In truth, it's just not a great model for the most important and the most complex decisions that you and I will make. We're not going to use it to help us decide where to go to college. We don't use it to help us choose a life partner. Most of us wouldn't even use it to choose where we want to live, okay? So what might we do instead? Well, this is where the second model on page 2 of your lecture outline comes into play. It says making good enough decisions. This model is called the bounded rationality model. So it's got that word rational in it. But basically the idea is that instead of trying to think of all the alternatives, we only think of some. And rather than trying to have an exhaustive set of decision criteria, once again, we limit the number of decision criteria that we might use. Example, you're going to pick your life partner. Well, let's be honest here. There are literally millions of possible alternatives. Millions. Millions of people you could hook up with. I mean, you're not gonna, right? And why not? Why aren't you gonna? Why aren't you even gonna test them all out? Well, practically speaking, how much time would that take? How much effort would that take? It would be ridiculous, right? We're not gonna do that. Instead, we're gonna set some boundaries around our decision making. We're not going to bother trying to think about or consider all of the alternatives. We're only going to consider, for example, the ones that are, relatively close geographically. We're only going to consider people who are in a certain age range. We're most likely only going to consider people with a certain socioeconomic status. People have a striking tendency to choose people for their life partners with whom they have a lot in common. That's not a fluke. That's because we basically, before we even really get to the decision-making phase, we've already decided not to consider all of the alternatives. We have narrowed the set. We have bounded the set of alternatives. Then we do some other things that are interesting when it comes to this kind of decision making, which I want to iterate for you, is the most common way that we make decisions, you and I, as adults, when we're making complex decisions. This is the model, not the rational decision making model. It's the bounded rationality model that we use. And as it turns out, that's okay. It's actually a great model to use. What we tend to do is pick the first model, if you will, that fits the bill. We stop our search for the perfect, the ideal, the optimal, and we latch on to the first alternative that seems to do at least a pretty decent job of hitting on the criteria that we care about the most. So take the example of a life partner. You want someone who's smart, maybe. You want someone who looks a certain way. You want someone who's funny. You want someone who shares a love of a certain kind of music with you. Whatever it might be, doesn't matter. You have your ideas about what your mate, your person, should have in terms of characteristics and behaviors. You have those things that you absolutely are, they're a no-go, they're a hard pass. You're not going to date or attach yourself to someone who's below or above a certain age range, etc. You narrow the field. You look pretty much around you. And the first person who seems to fit the bill, who also seems to think you fit the bill, well, that ends up being your person. You don't keep looking typically after you've found that person. You stop there. You say, this person is good enough. Now, that doesn't sound very romantic, but it's a reality, and it reflects the fact that you and I, frankly, well, we're not immortal, and we only have so much time on the planet, so we want to be pretty efficient with our decision making, and most of us would ideally like to find that life partner, let's say before the age of 40, whatever your age cutoff might be. Maybe you don't even have one, but for a lot of people, they do, at least theoretically. So yeah, they're going to go with the first choice. They're going to satisfy. That's the word that we use. That means to choose the first alternative that meets your minimum criteria. So the very first alternative. So this is satisficing. That's not a typo. It's not supposed to be satisfy. It's satisficing. We suboptimize, meaning we don't try to optimize our decision, in large part because we simply don't have the time and motivation and, well, all the other resources we would need to try and optimize that decision. A third model of decision-making is intuitive decision-making. Basically, this says, rather than using conscious reasoning, we basically follow our gut. Now, that may not sound like a very sophisticated way to make decisions, but in fact, people who are highly skilled decision makers, people at the top of organizations, for example, tend to rely pretty heavily on intuitive decision making. And the reason they can do that is because basically they've trained their gut to take into account all kinds of relevant information, to process that information, and then to reveal what the right decision most likely is. So, in fact, really smart people make intuitive decisions. Interestingly, for the most part, those decisions prove to be good ones. So this is pretty interesting, right? On the face of it, you might think, a rational decision-making approach would be the best. But in fact, that's not accurate, at least not for the really difficult, strategic, challenging decisions that we have to make as human beings. For those, frankly, the boundedly rational and the intuitive models are fantastic choices. Another decision-making model talks about creative decision-making. Creativity, as your lecture outline says, this is the bottom of page 2, is the generation of new and imaginative ideas. Those ideas, though, can't just be novel or new, they also have to be useful. At least if we're going to try and make decisions in organizations that rely upon our creativity. There's a 5-step model that's laid out for you on the bottom of page 2. I would encourage you to also carefully read the text to make sure that you understand what's happening in each of these steps. From recognizing the problem, okay, that's just like with rational decision-making, right? That's just the way it is with all decision-making, through immersion, incubation, illumination, and finally verification and application. And as I said, rather than me going on and on about that in this video, please look at your text and carefully read so that you can understand exactly what happens in each of those steps. So how do you know if your decision-making process is creative? How would you know? Well, there are 3 factors that we can use to help us evaluate whether a decision is in fact creative. First, we can look at fluency, which is all about how many ideas can a person generate. If I said to you, okay, I want you to think really creatively, I'm going to give you pool noodles. You know what those things are, right? The things that help us stay afloat in the pool. You know what I'm talking about, right? How many different things can you come up with that you might make out of pool noodles? And again, fluency is all about numbers. So how many? Second factor, flexibility. How different are those ideas from one another? So when a person starts to think about, what can I do with a pool noodle? I mean, the first thing we might think about is, well, it floats. And so you might think of a whole bunch of things where floating is a key characteristic. A raft, a little boat for Barbies. Again, so anything that has in common the fact that this pool noodle floats. Flexibility, though, is a test. Are you able to think of ideas that are in fact quite different from each other? You might think of a life raft, and then you might think of something that can be used to hold boots upright if you were to cut them, these pool noodles, into smaller sizes. Those are quite different things, right? That would be an example of flexibility. And finally, originality. How different are your ideas from other people's ideas? How unique are those ideas? Are they, in fact, really, really singular? Or is what you're coming up with pretty similar to what everybody usually comes up with? When I've done the exercise with pool noodles, for example, almost everybody comes up with life raft. So it's not terribly original, right? But I've seen some things that I thought were actually pretty interesting. Making bedding out of these things, making clothing out of pool noodles. There are any number of possibilities. The more unique, the more original. So those 3 things together, those 3 factors together, comprise creativity. Now, within an organization, what can we do to enhance our creativity? What can we do? Well, with teams, we can try to diversify those teams, get different perspectives cooking, change the group's membership, introduce new people into the team, maybe even go with a leaderless team where no one is appointed as the leader. What that does is it keeps the rest of the team from just looking to that person for all the ideas. With respect to team process, we might engage in brainstorming. You've all done this. We might use the nominal group technique. That's something that's described in your text. Or we might use analogies. For example, if I said to you, let's imagine that St. Norbert College wants to do a new marketing campaign, and I said to you, all right, what kind of animal do you think St. Norbert College is most like? Or what kind of car do you think St. Norbert College is most like? Or what country do you think St. Norbert College is most like? Again, the use of analogies to help us think about key characteristics of something that might also prod our thinking about those things in very different ways. With respect to leadership, leaders can challenge their teams to be creative, to come up with different ideas, to be more fluent, to come up with more, to be more flexible, to try and come up with ideas that are quite different from each other, and to be original. Try to think of something unique. We can let people decide how to achieve their own goals. What that does is it unleashes some of the creativity that is natural to those folks, rather than, again, people just looking to the leader for guidance. We most certainly have to support and celebrate creativity. There's a great line that says, "That which gets measured gets done." If we reward people for being creative, they will be creative. They will want to be creative because they'll want that reward. Now, keep in mind, we want to make sure the reward is something that they value, that has valence for them, We want them to believe that if they in fact come up with something really creative, they'll get that reward. That's, again, the instrumentality piece. And they have to believe that they can in fact exert sufficient effort to achieve that creative goal that we've set for them. That's expectancy. So we've got to do all of that. But no matter what, we've definitely got to positively or negatively reinforce people for being creative. Finally, as a leader, what we need to do is role model. What does it mean to be creative? Come up with, again, lots of ideas, flexible ideas, original ideas. Make it clear to people that this is something you value so much. As a leader, you do it. Finally, in terms of organizational culture, this is all the norms that the organization holds, all of those unwritten rules, the stories that we tell, the language that we use that makes us a unique organization, our culture. We have to institute organizational memory where it becomes clear that part of what has enabled us to succeed over time as an organization is the fact that we believe strongly in being creative and we reward that. We have to build physical spaces that are conducive to creativity, to make it possible for people to experiment with things, to not keep people so bound up. Anything that looks like a standard office space isn't very conducive to creativity. So we've got to introduce different kinds of things. This is why places like Google have what are, celebrated as remarkable spaces for people to work, where people can bring in whatever toys, whatever fun, they can do whatever they want, anything that will enable their creativity. Finally, incorporating creative behavior into everything we do, not making it a one-off. All right, those are some great ideas for what we can do to enhance organizational creativity. The rest of what you see on page 3 talks about Scamper, which is a checklist tool. Again, there I would direct your attention to the text. Make sure it's clear that you understand what that's all about. It's relatively straightforward. I think you won't have any problem latching on to those ideas. Some other ideas, also, again, on the bottom of page 3 of our lecture outline, brainstorming. We've all done it. Get in a group, throw out as many ideas as you can. Try not to criticize other people's ideas. Come up with the craziest ideas possible. Try to build on other people's ideas. And then set really high idea quotas. Like, we got to come up with 50 different ideas in a relatively short period of time. Boy, there's nothing like a little bit of pressure to help people be creative. Wildstorming is something else where people try to focus on ideas that they consider, at least right now, to be impossible. What would it take to make them possible? At some point, you and I will be kicked back casually in our self-driving cars or something like that. At one point in time, that would have been seen as completely outside the realm of possibility. But obviously, it's not. It is, in fact, possible. Yeah, there are some obstacles that need to be overcome for this to become a natural part of how we all get about. But is it possible? Sure it is, especially if we can overcome some of the issues associated with self-driving vehicles. The time will come. Finally, the last line on page 3 talks about crowdsourcing. Well, you all know what this is. This is something that social media enables us to do with relative ease, where we put an idea out into the interwebs, right? And we say, hey, I'm looking for ideas. And we crowdsource ideas, solutions for whatever problem we're trying to solve. All right, go on to page 4 of your lecture outline, where we're going to pull together how you might think about all 4 of these models. When should we use them? So, top of page 4, rational. When the information on alternatives can be gathered and quantified, the decision is important, and we're trying to maximize our outcome or optimize. We won't be satisfied with anything but the absolute best on all kinds of criteria. Remember what I said, this is really difficult to achieve, and often it would be incredibly inefficient for us to try and optimize. We simply would run out of time, given all of the possible alternatives. So we don't actually do that. Instead, we choose maybe the next option, which is bounded rationality. This is when the minimum criteria are very clear to us. We know what we want. We know exactly what we want. We don't have, or we're not willing to invest a whole lot of time in making the decision. And by this, with some things, given the number of possible alternatives, we could be talking about years before we would make the decision. And maybe we don't want to spend that much time. For example, when you were thinking about going to college, did you know how many colleges and universities there are in the United States alone? Thousands of them. Had you taken the time to review every single one of those options against the criteria that you cared about, things like geography, price, majors offered, whatever your criteria were, you'd be in your 40s perhaps before you finally got around to going to college, just because of the amount of time it would take to actually evaluate all of those alternatives against your decision criteria. Well, you're not going to do that. You want to make this decision fairly quickly, right? A lot of people want to make it by the time they're finished with their junior year of high school. So that doesn't leave you time to look at all the options. Finally, under bounded rationality, you're not really trying to maximize your outcome. You just want your outcome to be good enough. It's not about finding the perfect college, the best one in the entire world, perhaps, as finding one that's good enough for you, one that feels like home, one where you're pretty sure you'll be able to do what you want to do, and that when you graduate, you're likely to find a job and be able to be a success in your profession. That's what you're digging. That's what you want. You don't need it to be perfect. You need it to be good enough. Intuitive decision-making is perfect when goals are unclear, when there's a lot of time pressure, and when analysis paralysis would be costly. That phrase, analysis paralysis, what that means is we spend so much time generating data, analyzing that data, trying to pick apart that data in order to help us make a decision that we become paralyzed. We keep asking for more information, and basically we put off making the decision, perhaps to the point where making the decision is no longer going to be okay. We will have missed the window of opportunity. Another organization will have beat us to the market with whatever product they came up with, instead of our product being the one that could have made a difference for people. Also, intuitive decision-making is great if you've got experience with the problem. You've made a similar decision in the past, so you have a sense of what matters. Finally, creative decision-making, when the solutions aren't clear, so we've got to invent some stuff, we've got to come up with ideas. That's the new solutions need to be generated, and we have the time to immerse ourselves in the issues so that we can, in fact, come up with a really great creative decision. As Edna Mode will tell you, it's relatively easy to make bad decisions. If you're not sure about this, just go ahead and rewatch from The Incredibles her whole scene where she talks about what might not be so great about capes. Yikes. So what are some of the issues? I'm on page 4 of your lecture outline right now, looking at faulty decision-making, some of the decision-making traps that you and I are prone to fall into. The first being anchoring and adjustment bias. Basically, you and I, all people, have this tendency to put too much weight on numbers, especially numbers that don't actually have anything to do with the decision we're trying to make. Facts that really don't matter, that shouldn't be driving our decision-making. But basically, we get anchored by those facts or by those numbers. We get stuck in a particular way of thinking, and then we can't broaden our thinking in the way that we should. A second deals with availability bias, and this is where we tend to see whatever is right in front of us as being something that, oh my gosh, it's everywhere. For example, if I tell you that, man, you know what I've noticed? A lot of people wearing yellow lately. Guess what? All of a sudden, when you're walking about, you're going to notice even more how many people are wearing yellow. Think about with the whole coronavirus thing, how much more we might notice people coughing, people sniffling. People do these things all the time. But when it's brought to our attention over and over, when social media is pounding on the idea, guess what? We're going to hear every sniffle and every cough as possibly indicative of the coronavirus, because that's the information that's being put in front of us today. A third deals with escalation of commitment. This is basically when you and I, when people in general, stick to something even long after it's been proven that it ain't working. One of my favorite examples of this is an interpersonal one. Years ago when I was an undergraduate, I had two friends, on and off again, boyfriend, girlfriend. And I mean, it was, they're together, they're not together, they're together, they're not together. And, it was, okay, as friends, as their friends, we were always kind of like not quite sure, are these people together or are they not together? So finally, at one point, I asked the woman in the relationship, I said, so Michelle, I said, what is the deal? Why? So you break up. Why do you two keep getting back together? I don't get it. Her answer, perfect example of escalating commitment, was this. I've invested a lot of time in this relationship. A lot of time in this relationship. And I feel like I just need to keep trying. Well, guess what? The investment's over. It's done. It's a sunk cost. Escalating commitment, sticking with something even after it becomes obvious it ain't working, is bad decision making. People do it though, and not just in interpersonal relationships. For example, in organizations, people will continue to put lots and lots of money toward projects even after it's been demonstrated they're not working. Like new IT systems, new enterprise resource systems, millions of dollars perhaps. And when somebody says, it's not working, the answer might be, yeah, but we've already invested. Well, you know what? The reality is that money's gone. You got to move on. A third error, something that we've seen before when we talked in the very beginning about attribution, is fundamental attribution error. This is when we believe that the good things that happen to us are because, what we've done, and the bad things that happen to us are because of external circumstances. So all the good I get credit for, all the bad is outside of my control. That's a fundamental attribution error. Hindsight bias is where we make pronouncements like, I knew that all along. No, you didn't. You actually didn't. The reason you maybe feel like you knew it all along is because as the evidence has piled up, here you are in the future, and what was going to happen seems like an obvious thing. But back, you didn't really know. So using hindsight, they always say hindsight is 20/20. When you look backwards in your life, you could say to yourself, I should have seen that coming. Well, should you have? Probably not. I mean, if you really could have seen it coming, you would have, but you didn't. So when you say that you did, even though you didn't, that's called hindsight bias. I knew the Packers were going to go to the Super Bowl in whatever year. Of course you didn't really. You can't unless you've got some amazing power to see the future. You may have predicted such a thing based upon a certain set of data, but you didn't actually know. You couldn't. No one can. When we talk about correlation and causality, this is a sticky one. We are so good at mixing these two things up. And we forget that just because two things maybe both go up together or down together, or when one goes up, the other one always goes down, we think, one must be causing the other. One of my favorite examples of this mistake is when politicians say things like, because of how amazing I am, look at that stock market, or look at that economy, or look at fill in the blank. It doesn't matter who we're talking about. I'm not calling out any particular politician. I'm talking about all of them. They mistake correlation and causation. The fact that they're in office right now, imagining that somehow that, perhaps by itself, is why the market or the economy or whatever is doing what it's doing. This is baloney. The reality is there are lots of factors that contribute, let's say, to the stock market doing what it does, or the economy doing what it does. No politician, not any politician ever, is solely responsible for such a thing. It's simply a correlation. They happen to be there when it happens. I saw a great example of something depicting a correlation and not a causation. It was a picture of a T-Rex, and the caption was something like, "Couldn't wash its hands, now it's extinct." Again, sort of a dark humor play on all this coronavirus stuff, right? So that poor T-Rex, which couldn't look to wash its hands, well, that's why the dinosaurs disappeared. That's ridiculous, right? Absolutely ridiculous. So we have to be able to separate correlation from causation. Overconfidence bias, the last thing on page 4, occurs when, again, people overestimate their ability to predict future events. They are quite sure that they know what will happen. Well, there's a reason there's such a thing as gambling. It's because, in fact, there are very few things where the probability equals 1. In fact, almost with everything, the probability of anything occurring runs somewhere from 0 to 1, maybe 50-50, right? You don't really know exactly what will happen. You can't possibly. But some people will act as if they do, and they'll insist on making decisions that reflect that overconfident bias. Looking at the top of page 5, we've got framing bias, which is essentially what happens when we make decisions and we're influenced by however the problem or situation is presented to us. If it's presented to us, for example, as a problem of scarcity, we tend to see it as a problem of scarcity. If it's presented to us as a problem of communication, that's where we'll be thinking about all of the possible solutions. So how something is framed or presented has a tendency to severely limit how we think about a problem or situation. And it can be very difficult, in fact, to break away from that original frame or presentation. Finally, the last one mentioned on the top of page 5 is one that I've already talked about with respect to the bounded rationality model, this notion of satisficing, where we tend to select the first acceptable alternative instead of trying to look for the best possible alternative. And I would still argue that often this is, in fact, the absolute right thing to do. And we shouldn't discount it simply because we think, oh, optimal, that must mean it's always the best. Well, no, it doesn't. Not if it's going to take too much time. Not if by the time we make that decision, it's too late. Well, then that so-called optimal decision isn't a very good one, is it? And maybe the satisficing solution would have been better. The final major topic in this chapter is decision-making in groups, hence the Green Bay Packers hat, one of the greatest groups, teams of all time. I just said that. I did. Deal with it. Okay. Anyway, when it comes to decision-making, you might wonder, are 2 heads, or maybe more than 2, better than 1? Well, there are pros and cons associated with individual decision-making and group or team decision-making. As you can see on page 5 of your lecture outline, when we talk about making decisions by yourself as an individual, pros include things like it's usually faster, rather than having to confer with other people. If one person can just make the decision, voila, the decision is made. Sometimes the best individual in a group really should go ahead and make the decision because that person has maybe got a better bead on the situation. Maybe they're the smartest when it comes to that particular topic. They should go ahead and make the decision. Also, when individuals make decisions, it's much easier to hold them accountable. Basically, I made this decision. Therefore, if things don't go well, That's on me, as opposed to a group makes a decision. Now who do we blame? Do we point, and it doesn't go well, I should say, who do we blame? Do we call everybody out, or do we try to figure out, well, who was sort of the catalyst for that group decision? Again, it's much easier to hold people accountable if they're making decisions by themselves. The negatives associated with individual decision making are pretty significant. You don't get as many ideas. Trying to figure out who the best individual to make a decision, if we wanted to go with that approach, can in fact be really challenging. How do we know who is going to be the smartest person in the group with respect to a particular decision-making topic? Finally, when we're left alone to make decisions, we might put them off. Sometimes having that pressure of being in the group gets us to make decisions in a more timely fashion. Now, under group decision-making, we also have pros and cons. A pro, we're going to have more ideas and hopefully more diverse ideas. So again, more fluency, more flexibility, more originality. A downside, you get people together to make decisions, to throw out ideas. It's going to take longer than if an individual did it alone. When you have the group doing it, you're going to get greater commitment to the ideas. Whatever comes out of it, the group is going to be more on board with. Downside, you can have something called groupthink, which I'll talk about in just a minute here, and that's not a good thing. Finally, a pro for group decision-making is that interaction can be a lot of fun. Being around other people is something that we, as human beings, prefer. For the most part, we do. I mean, just compare sitting in class versus you just watching this video. The energy isn't the same. It can't be, right? And it's not just because you and I aren't in person. It's because the other folks in the room also aren't there. So I can't turn to y'all and say, why don't you chat with some people around you for a couple of minutes and see what you can come up with? Group decision-making can be pretty awesome. On the other hand, you can also end up with social loafing. This is something we talked about in the teams chapter, where because you got the whole group, maybe some people in the group don't do their fair share. Now, I want to come back to this idea of groupthink. Your text talks about this in more detail, and you see the symptoms of groupthink chart or figure on the bottom of page 5 of your lecture outline. I just want to highlight a couple of these things. And first, I want to talk about an incident that is considered sort of a classic example of groupthink. Back in 1986, the Challenger was scheduled to take flight. The Challenger, if you're not familiar, is a space shuttle, U.S. space shuttle. And on that particular flight, there was going to be a school teacher, Krista McAuliffe. And part of what was going to happen is she was going to teach from space. On the day of the shuttle launch, she, along with the other astronauts, lifted off. And less than a few minutes later, the shuttle exploded, killing all of the astronauts on board. Now, why is this a good example or a case that can be used to illustrate groupthink? Well, for that, I need to walk you back to the night before the shuttle launch, when NASA officials were meeting with a variety of people, contractors, who'd been involved in building the shuttle. And 2 engineers, not from NASA, but from another organization, were arguing that they thought the launch should be delayed because of the temps that were expected the next morning. They believed that the temps were too low for one of the parts, and that as a result, the part would not correctly perform its function. The results could or might not be devastating, but nonetheless, these 2 engineers tried to press the point that they really thought the launch should be delayed. The officials from NASA pushed back. They had already delayed the launch once, and further delay was going to be incredibly expensive. So unless they had hard evidence, proof, irrefutable proof that in fact the temps were going to cause the problem that the engineers thought it might cause, well, they were going to go ahead with the launch. All of this was taking place on a conference call. A conference call that was transcripted. So it was recorded. And we know exactly who said what during this conference call. This is a for real thing. You can look it up. You can Google it. You'll find it. Challenger, transcript, NASA. And basically what happened is that because of pressure from the overall group, including the group's leader, these two engineers eventually gave up and quit trying to press their case. And in the end, the leader of the call says something to the effect of, well, if I'm not going to hear any more objections, I'm going to assume that everybody is on board with going ahead with this launch. And as I said, the two engineers at this point felt as though they'd been beaten down, and trying to continue their fight just didn't seem worth it. So they didn't say anything more. What happened the next day ultimately was exactly what they feared. The part that they were concerned about, O-rings, didn't function properly. And that's what caused the malfunction in the shuttle, which ultimately led to the explosion, which led to the death of all the astronauts. It was a terrible, horrible, horrible example of what groupthink can yield in terms of decisions and outcomes. So what are we talking about? When you look at that figure, groups that are affected by groupthink will often have this illusion of invulnerability, meaning nothing could possibly go wrong. After all, in the example of the Challenger, we're NASA. We're the best. We have PhDs making all kinds of decisions. We couldn't possibly make a mistake. We rationalize by arguing facts, insisting, for example, that these engineers couldn't possibly be right because they didn't have data where they had some evidence that the temperature that was most likely going to be the temperature the following morning, they didn't have evidence very specific to that exact temperature. They had other data, but it wasn't the exact same. And so it was rationalized, well, you don't have exactly that data. Therefore, your conclusions are incorrect. Unquestioned belief in morality, where we think, hey, we know how to make an ethical decision. You're not questioning us, are you? We know what we're doing. We're smart people. We would never do anything to hurt people. No question as to, hey, maybe we should take a step back. None of that. I want to go down to direct pressure on arguers. If you look up the transcript, you'll see that the two engineers who tried to make their case were basically shut down, essentially told to shut up, to stop talking. Well, I think most of us in that situation would do just that. We would stop talking. The illusion of unanimity, you see this to the left of that figure, where we decide that since no one is actively disagreeing with us, it must mean that everyone is unanimously in agreement. That's what ultimately happens in this conference call. The two engineers give up. They stop talking. So when the head of the call says, does this mean that we're all in agreement? We're all on board with this? We can go ahead with the launch? Nobody says anything different. And so there's this illusion, this belief that everybody's on the same page, even though they're not. Groupthink is dangerous. It's something we want to avoid. So if you go to the last page of your lecture outline 6, you see some recommendations for how we can avoid it. Within groups, one thing we can do is discuss the symptoms of groupthink and how can we avoid that. Perhaps the one that I think is the most important is to formally appoint someone to serve as the devil's advocate, someone who will question what's being said in the group, someone who will say, you know what, even though we don't have exactly that data, we have other data that's sufficiently suggestive to give us pause. We should not be going forward with this. Do we really want to risk the lives of these astronauts? Not to mention the reputational hit that NASA took in the aftermath of this. Perhaps we invite other experts in to give us their insight. We can encourage a culture of difference where we, in fact, value different ideas, where we're not trying to get to the same place as quickly as possible, but rather we're looking to hear different ideas. For individuals, I'm going to skip down. With individuals, we have to monitor our own personal behavior to make sure that we're not slipping into just going along with things for the sake of going along. We have to not censor ourselves. If we think there's an issue, we need to raise that issue. We also need to, again, slipping down, we need to avoid putting pressure on other people to conform, to just go along with us. No more of the, oh, come on, man, you should just agree with us. We just want to get done with this. We just want to move on with this. No, instead, listen to those folks who may have other ideas. Group leaders can do things like break the overall group in two, give them both the same assignment, and then call them back together later to see what they've come up with. Perhaps they'll have a different approach. That should be considered. Also, setting a tone of encouraging critical evaluations. The leader needs to make sure to do this. But actually, the one right before I want to emphasize, the leader needs to wait to speak. As soon as the leader talks, other people are going to take their cues from that leader and think, I need to go along with that person. That person is the person in authority. That doesn't have to be the case, and in fact, often shouldn't be the case. So as a leader, your best bet for trying to ensure that your group doesn't suffer from groupthink and end up making really bad decisions is to keep your own mouth shut, at least initially. Really encourage other people to talk first. These are just some ideas for how we might avoid groupthink. The very last topic from the chapter is how to make better decisions. What can we do? And you see a whole host of approaches, starting with the nominal group technique, working down to using decision trees. With a nominal group technique, for example, we have everyone in a room, everyone in the group participate, but everybody writes their own ideas down first. And then one at a time, they share them out with the group. And after all the ideas are put out there, then they discuss. So it isn't, okay, who's got an idea? And just wait for people to volunteer, but rather insist that everybody write their own ideas down first. And then go follow up with, okay, what did you put? What did you think? And then discuss it. The Delphi technique is a bit different than that, where people do written responses, perhaps to a whole host of questions, and then those responses are put together by an expert, and those are used to help the group reach a consensus. Sometimes we'll do majority rule. We all know what that is. Sometimes we'll try to achieve consensus. Consensus doesn't mean that everybody has to agree. What it means is that we all agree that we won't disagree further. We're okay enough with what the group wants to conclude. That's reaching a consensus. Then you see group decision support systems, decision trees. Again, these are a bit more refined. I encourage you to read your text carefully to see what the text has to say about these two options. With that, we've reached the end of the video for Chapter 11, Making Decisions. Thanks for hanging in there, team.